We made it. Welcome to the last day. We made it. That smile is weird with this on the screen. This is the end of our intertestamental period. We're going to end it today. So I'm officially taking next week off. So I will not be doing anything this week. Or next week. For that, I'll be prepping. In 2 weeks, we'll be back in this place, starting the Gospel of John. That will coincide with the launch of the normal Sunday school year. And if you haven't heard, they need Sunday school teachers. You don't have to do it every week, but any help you can give would be great. And then also, we'd love to have you in here, so please come back. So, I am really excited about having been able to do this. Thank you so much for letting me indulge my historical curiosities with the intertestamental study. It's been an absolute blast, and I'm really excited to get into the Gospel of John because it's a whole nother, it's its own special, unique thing, and it's extremely Lutheran, and it's going to be really great. So I'm really excited about that. So, does anybody know what this is a picture of? It's Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
But what's happening to it?
Burning.
It's burning.
Yeah.
Who's burning it?
I think it's the Romans.
The Romans, right? So we're going to go today from about 70 BC all the way through the destruction of the temple at 70 AD. And that's sort of the end of the Jewish kingdom as it's known. In 70 AD, the temple gets destroyed. In 135 AD, the Jewish kingdom is basically erased, and they rename it Palestine, and they ship all the Jews off to wherever because they don't even want them to be a people anymore. So we're going to get through that today. And one of the reasons it's really important that we studied this whole period is that one of the unique things about John's Gospel is that we think it was written after the destruction of the temple. So this is in light, and especially in Revelation, we think it's after the destruction of the temple. So it's relevant, and that'll come up as we get into studying that stuff. So you can see in this picture here, you've got the temple that Solomon built, or not Solomon, the temple that Herod built. We'll talk about Herod today. The fortress of Antonia that the Romans used, and you've got the Mount of Olives and the Garden of the Gethsemane over here. Golgotha would be right around in here, somewhere in this place, and north is this way. And so we'll get into all this today. So I'm going to start for the last time with Psalm 125, prayed in Jesus' name, and then we'll get going. So please pray with me. Those who trust in Jesus are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so Jesus surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. Do good, O Jesus, to those who are good and to those who are upright in their hearts. But those who turn aside to their crooked ways, Jesus will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. All right. So, last time we wrapped up talking about the last sort of stable ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty, Alexandra. She ruled from 76 to 67. This was just after a civil war had broken out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jet engine off here. A little burst of cold air. So this was just after the end of a civil war, and she lets the Pharisees come back home, and she rules from 76 until 67. She appoints her son, Hyrcanus II, to be the high priest, and she wears the crown. And remember, this is the resolution of a long-standing issue where the crown and the what's the name of the tall hat? The mitre, where the crown and the mitre were worn by the same person. So the high priest and the king were the same person. Well, she can't be the high priest because she's a woman, so she appoints her son the high priest. After she dies, the question is what's going to happen. So she dies, and after this, and remember, the Jewish kingdom is actually almost an empire at this point. We've got a very large area rivaling that of even Solomon. Remember last time we talked about John Hyrcanus had done the forced conversion at the sword and with the knife, if you know how Jews convert, of Idumea and Samaria. That means that some people in Idumea got converted, and their son Antipater would have gotten converted, and then his son Herod would have been raised as a Jew, and that's going to have massive implications for what we study today. So, her two kids, Hyrcanus II, appointed high priest while Alexandra is the queen. He rules for a very short amount of time because he's got a younger brother named Aristobulus II, who's, instead of being a Pharisee sympathizer like Alexandra and Hyrcanus, actually leans more toward the Sadducees and is a much stronger personality, much more assertive, and decides that I'm going to be the king. So he goes to war, another civil war starts out, and he kicks his brother out. He kicks his brother out of the crown, kicks his brother out of the high priesthood, so Hyrcanus just goes. Hyrcanus steps down. There's this guy named Antipater, okay, or Antipater. Antipater, he's a general who for a while now has been sort of the main general of the Jewish army under the Pharisees. So he was an Idumean, he was an Edomite who got converted, joined the army, and is sort of the guy who makes all the decisions for the army. Hyrcanus steps down. Antipater thinks, oh, well, Aristobulus isn't going to keep me in my high position, so I'm going to convince Hyrcanus that, no, you don't want to do this, you need to fight back. So not only do they start to fight, they get the Nabateans, who, reminder, there's an Arab kingdom down here. So they get another outside kingdom to come attack the Jewish homeland again, and this goes poorly. So you've got this civil war happening until in 63 BC, in this history, we've been seeing the Romans first, they were here, then they were here, then they were here. Now they're on the doorstep, right? The Romans are ready, and the Jews, so far, remember, with the Seleucids, and several times with the Seleucids, and then also against the Egyptians, the Jews had turned to, can you hit up on the air conditioning for me, Caitlin? Until it says 75, so this stops. Thank you. Got it? Thank you. So the Jews had turned to Rome several times to solve their problems. Okay? So back in the 160s and 140s when they turned to Rome, Rome was way over here, and remember, there was a kingdom in between Rome and the Jews, and the Romans thought, oh, well, if we make them weaker by propping up the Jews, this will make these guys weaker, and it'll keep our boundaries at home safe. Well, at this time, in the 60s, the view has changed. Okay? In Roman society, if you wanted to be a good Roman, how did you do it? Okay, in our society today, what's like the number one virtue in public America? I think it's niceness. Honestly, I think it's niceness and tolerance. Everybody's great. The government and God is the senile grandpa with Werther's in his pocket. Just give me nice things, but don't worry about what I'm doing. Right? That's the number one virtue in our culture, right? Yeah. Say in the 40s in America, the number one virtue was patriotism, right? Right? Back then, if you were a Roman, if you wanted to be a good Roman, the entire society was driven around this idea that you need to be ambitious. You want to do big, great things. You're going to go do big, great things. And if you don't, and even if you don't, that's fine, but you have to want to. Not everybody's going to get to do big, great things, but if you want to be big and powerful and be remembered as a good Roman, you're going to go do big, great things, right? I'm reminded of my time at Valpo, where the chair of the Christ College looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're going to change the world. I see a merit scholar in you, and I see, and I'm not sure what she'd think of me now being a stay-at-home dad, but I think I'm doing great things now, right? And as Christians, thanks be to God that we have great examples of faithful, wonderful people where God uses the weak to change the world, right? But if you're a Roman, you've got to go change the world. So there's this guy named Pompey, okay? He just finished conquering all of this. He, back in the day, one of the biggest changes that the Romans brought about, and one of the reasons they were so successful, is before the Romans, this whole area here, the Mediterranean, was filled with pirates. Now, I'm not talking like eye patch, peg leg pirates, but if you had a boat out there, you had to be careful because someone was going to steal it. So this guy Pompey clears the whole thing of pirates. Okay? This is the first time in human history the Mediterranean has been safe for economic travel. So, if you don't have to worry about spending extra money to pay soldiers to be on your ships, all of a sudden all the stuff you're selling is cheaper, so more people can have food to eat, right? Down here in Egypt, they had all the food, okay? Think of Joseph. So now all of a sudden the food can get to Rome, can get to Greece, can get to the Middle East without pirates stealing it, okay? So Pompey does this amazing thing and gets rid of all the pirates. He does this amazing thing and he starts conquering Syria. Well, our two buddies, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, both the second, decide, well, we have a civil war, let's just go ask the Romans to settle it. And Pompey's up here in Damascus and he goes, sure, I'll come down with an army and try and figure this out for you. Yeah, why not? You know, what's one more feather in my cap? So, this guy named Pompey, a famous general in Roman history, he defeats the pirates, he defeats Mithridates, who was a king from up here, was a big thorn in the Roman side for a long time, this Mithridates guy. He was part of something called the First Triumvirate. Does anybody know what that is?
Three.
The three is involved.
Caesar, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavius and Pompey.
So the first, you got your two triumvirates mixed up. So Pompey was part of this group of people. It was him, Caesar, and this guy named Crassus. Okay? And they, at the time, they didn't call themselves the first triumvirate. The second one did call themselves a triumvirate, but the first one just said, we're going to be buddies and do what we need to do politically, because remember, this is a republic at the time in Rome, and it's a republic, but it's really kind of like a mob family, where powerful families with lots of money decide how things go. So these three guys decide, all right, well, we want to be strong and powerful. Pompey's got a bunch of soldiers who are unhappy because they've spent their entire lives fighting, but they don't have any farms to go to. So Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar decide, oh, well, all this land that we're conquering, we're going to pass some new laws and give it all to Pompey's soldiers. So now all of Pompey's soldiers are super excited. All of Pompey's soldiers, are they loyal to Rome or are they loyal to Pompey? Pompey, right? He's the one making sure they've got food on the table. Right? So one of the big problems in Roman history is all of a sudden the Roman soldiers are starting to become loyal, not to the government, but loyal to individual people. Okay? They don't really care about Rome, the country, anymore. They care about this one guy. Okay? And they follow him and not necessarily what the country wants or needs. Let the reader understand. So, Pompey's part of this. This guy, Crassus, was the richest guy in the world at the time. Eventually, Crassus is going to buy an army, march out into the desert, and disappear because the Parthians are going to rip him apart. And the richest man in the world is now dead. Right? It's like as if Elon Musk decided to go buy an army and then march into the Western China, and then we never heard from him again. Right? So, what happens is Hyrcanus and Aristobulus appeal to Pompey for help deciding the disputes. That's where I'm at. Pompey decides that he decides ultimately in the end in favor of Hyrcanus. This is after a bit of a back and forth. There was some bribery that Aristobulus did. Eventually, Pompey decides for Hyrcanus. Aristobulus decides, I'm going to fight back. So, and the map's not really all that important, but Aristobulus says, I'm going to fight back. So first, he tries to fight the army that Pompey sends. Okay, Pompey doesn't go down himself. That army defeats Aristobulus. Aristobulus backs up into the temple, fortifies himself in there, because remember, the temple has its own set of walls. So Pompey comes down and beats them down. He actually enters the Holy of Holies, Pompey does. He does this, and it looks like, historically, he was just kind of ignorant. He didn't know what he was doing. Because he walks in there, finds out he wasn't supposed to be in there, turns around and walks out. And the weird thing that Pompey does, he doesn't take any money from the temple, right? We've seen that in this study, that several times people have taken money from the temple for their own purposes. The Seleucids did it a lot, right? And Pompey walks into the Holy of Holies, realizes, oh, I'm not supposed to be here, leaves, doesn't take any of the money. So now the Romans, once again, kind of look like they're the good guys here. But in this civil war, something like 15,000 Jews die. Okay? So as we've seen, ever since, say, the end of John Hyrcanus the first's reign, there have been tons of civil wars and tons of infighting with the Jewish people. Right? So now the Romans walk in, Pompey walks in and says, okay, you guys can't be quiet and figure out your problems, so I'm going to put Hyrcanus on the throne, but that general we talked about, Antipater, he actually becomes the person who has all the power. Because Hyrcanus isn't strong enough to fight back, and Rome, when they want something done from now on, they say, hey, Antipater, you go do this. Okay? So effectively, the Jews still have what's called an ethnarch, so a king that is theirs, a local Jew to rule them, but they're now under the thumb of the Romans. The Jews can't really do anything unless the Romans say it's okay. They're now in the situation where, oh, it would be a shame if all the windows on your shop get broken. It'd be great if you paid me a little money and I'll protect your shop so that nobody comes by and vandalizes your shop, as in like the movie The Godfather, right? So the Romans are now on the doorstep controlling things because the Jews just couldn't keep to themselves. Okay? Any questions? Caitlin, you look like you had a ponderous thought in your head. Nope, you're good? Okay, all right. Anything going on in there?
Nope.
Okay, all right. So Antipater becomes the effective governor of the area. So now you have a local, quote, king and a local high priest who's Jewish, but there's an Edomite actually in charge. Okay? So, after this, how many of you have heard of Julius Caesar? Please raise your hands. Okay? Bertie, Sherman, have you heard of Julius Caesar? Yes, you have. All right, cool. All right, so after this happens, world politics start to play a role. Okay? So, after a while, Pompey and Caesar start to not be so friendly with each other. Caesar decides, what Caesar does, how can I say this succinctly? Caesar realizes that, let me back up. There's these two camps in Roman society. There's the Optimates, which are the old families, the rich families, the senators. Rome has 300 senators. And then there's this other political group called the Populares, who are the populists. Okay? Caesar sees an opportunity and says, oh, all these poor people, I'm going to go be the populist guy and fight for them, promise them food and things, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to gain power. So he's off in Gaul. Pompey and Caesar fight some wars against each other. Caesar eventually says, the Roman Senate says, basically, put down your army and come here so we can arrest you. And Caesar says, I'll only do that if Pompey does it. And the Senate says, oh no, he's our guy. He's an Optimate, so he likes the Senate. So Pompey says, oh no, I'm not putting down my army. So Caesar decides, okay. So Caesar marches down. He's at, he crosses this river, and there's a phrase we have for when you make a big decision. You cross the what?
Rubicon.
The Rubicon, right? So he's at the Rubicon River, which is the border between Italy proper and the rest of the barbarian world where nothing matters. If you bring an army across the Rubicon, you have broken the law and you are now an outlaw. So, Caesar brings an army down, he crosses the Rubicon, he says the phrase, the die is cast, that's where that comes from. Caesar crosses the Rubicon, civil war breaks out, Caesar demands, he gets called dictator for life, and then in 44 BC, what happens to him? He gets a bunch of holes put in. So, Caesar eventually becomes estranged from Pompey. Aristobulus initially sides with Caesar because he knows Hyrcanus is Pompey's buddy. Aristobulus gets poisoned, so Aristobulus is gone. Pompey gets defeated and killed in Egypt. Antipater, and this is a really common thing that happens with the Herods, with the Herodian dynasty. Antipater says, all right, well, Pompey's losing power, so I'm going to go bribe Caesar and become Caesar's buddy. And so Antipater becomes Caesar's ally. In return, Caesar not only says, all right, Antipater, you get to be in charge, he offers him Roman citizenship. Okay? Why is that important? Does anybody know your Roman history?
He gets all kinds of extra protections.
All kinds of legal protections and rights. Okay? If you weren't a Roman citizen, you weren't a human. Okay? But if you were a Roman citizen, you had to be tried. You could appeal to Rome. Paul does this in the book of Acts. They want to kill him in Judea, and he says, I appeal to Nero. And the Romans are like, okay, he said the thing. Okay, everybody stop. It's sort of the Miranda rights thing. Or not, it's the TV version, I need a lawyer, right? And then everybody stops and they stop the questions again. In Rome, if you say, I appeal to Caesar, everybody stops. The Romans take Paul, remove him from the situation because they know he's a Roman citizen, and ship him off to Rome, because those are the rules, right? A lot of ancient Roman history is completely centered around local tribes fighting to be allowed to be called Roman citizens. Because if you're a Roman citizen, you get a whole bunch of stuff. If you're not a Roman citizen, you're cattle, right? So, Antipater gets Roman citizenship. This is a big deal. He becomes Caesar. He wins this war. He gives the Jews religious liberty, which was not guaranteed at the time. And Antipater becomes the procurator, so he becomes the governor, sort of Judea, and his sons are appointed over Galilee and Judea. Then, as happens so often, he gets assassinated, right? There's a local Jewish guy who doesn't like the fact that an Edomite is ruling over them, so he gets assassinated. All right. So, at this time, something crazy happens. Okay? So, Caesar dies in 44. Oh, Paul, what's up?
From the assassinations and how often they happened, what was the consequence of that?
Oh, you're tortured, you die a very violent, awful death. Yeah, I mean, they know who did it. They caught the guy.
And then he's put to trial or just put to death, or?
Oh, there's no trial. He's just gone. Yeah, he's just tortured.
It's a
The guy who killed him was not a citizen.
one-for-one thing, right? You take that life.
Not just one for one. I mean, it's probably,
The whole family?
it's probably his whole family, right? Think about what Marlon Brando would have done, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so good question. But we think we know who the guy was, and he died shortly thereafter.
But yet, later on in Roman history, when these assassinations or these coups take place, doesn't seem like there's trials, there's any kind of retribution for
So later on,
some of them.
later on in Roman history, you've got the situation where, like I said, people start to become loyal to governors, not to people. So we'll learn later on about this guy named Vespasian, who helped destroy Jerusalem. There's a crisis. Nero has let Rome destroy itself. Vespasian goes back. The reason that he can go assume the empire is because it's not just him. It's him and a giant army, right? You and what army? Well, he had one, right? He literally had one. Now, if you're just one assassin, if you get away, great. If you don't, you get killed. But a lot of these assassinations, the other thing that happened a lot in Roman history was remember what I said about you can't bring an army into Rome? There's only one army in Rome, the Praetorian Guard. Guess who killed the most emperors? The Praetorian Guard. Okay? Because guess what they liked? Money. So if you could pay off the Praetorian Guard, they could kill the emperor. There's no other army in town. So they get away with it. Right? So there's a whole lot of money changing hands. The Praetorian Guard killed a lot of emperors. Okay? So if you were popular and had your own army, or you could afford to kill off the emperor via the Praetorian Guard, you're good to go. Does that make sense? Yeah.
like Chicago.
There's a lot of politics. Yeah, I mean, politics back then was money, right?
So was the Praetorian Guard like an elite military branch, or what was it? How many were in it?
It was the Romans of the Romans. A couple thousand people, and they're the only ones legally allowed to be in the city with weapons. Okay? Nobody else is allowed to have anything. But if, let's say you're in the Praetorian Guard, and most of you are from rich families because it's really cool to be in the Praetorian Guard, it's really a great job. So all the rich families want their sons to go be in the Praetorian Guard. And then the emperor comes in and says, well, I want to take some of the rich people's money and give it to the poor. The Praetorian Guard might not like that. So they decide, let's have a change in leadership, right? Okay, they did a little regime change, a little nation building, right? So, after that, after Caesar dies, things get a little wild because the Roman army is more concerned with stabilizing things at home, because this breaks out into a civil war. The Optimates and basically Caesar's buddies try and go and kill all the people that work together to kill Caesar. Okay? So there's a bit of a vacuum in Judea. The Jews try and reassert their authority, but one of Aristobulus, remember he's the guy who didn't win the negotiations, his son goes over here to the Parthians, which is basically the Persian successor state, and says, hey, come on into Judea, right? So once again, a Jewish wannabe king decides to appeal to a foreign power. So then for a little bit, all of a sudden the Parthians actually control Judea. Okay, the Parthians, they actually come from up here in northern Iran, but they conquer basically most of the old Persian Empire, and they kind of assume that we are the Persians now. So they try and fight back and conquer, all of Babylon and this area here, the Mesopotamian area. So they fight over that. Herod the Great, okay, he flees, goes to Rome, and says, hey, Rome, the Parthians are in Judea now. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And then all of a sudden, Herod's buddies are like, oh, well, let's just make you the king. And now, all of a sudden, Herod gets control of all this stuff if he can take it. Basically, if you can go back and reconquer this stuff, it's yours. Well, guess what? He does. Okay? So, then we get Herod. So Herod goes and reconquers Judea, that whole big area that we talked about that Alexander had. He conquers the whole thing, kicks the Parthians out, puts the Jews down. He's appointed the king in 40 BC by the Senate. He conquers everything, and either 36 or 37. The years are not real certain. There's some ambiguity about when he started. The calendar, Jesus is probably born in either 2 BC or 4 BC as we currently count it. Okay, that 0 BC or AD, that transition, was determined by a monk in the Middle Ages, and we have more information now based on things like supernova history and new records about who was king where and when. So the actual date he started is not entirely certain, but he becomes king and takes over in 36 or 37. And he, just like his father, his whole motto in life is, I'm going to be loyal to Rome, whoever's there. Okay? Whoever's in charge. So first, in the east, the second triumvirate after Caesar dies, as Garrett pointed out, Mark Antony gets in charge. So it's Mark Antony, this other general, name starts with an L, I don't remember, and then this guy named Octavian, who was Augustus's adopted son. Okay? Eventually, Octavian becomes Caesar Augustus. Julius Caesar's family name becomes the name of the title for king, essentially, right? Caesar. So the word, the Russian word, Tsar, that's just Caesar with a Russian accent.
As is Kaiser.
Okay? Huh?
As is Kaiser.
As is Kaiser. So the German word for the ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm, that's just Caesar Wilhelm. Okay? So 2,000 years later, people are still using Julius Caesar's name as a title, right? So Augustus Caesar, everybody else is called the Caesar because they're in the line of the guy who was dictator for life. Caesar Augustus becomes the first emperor, so at first Herod is loyal to Antony, then he's loyal to Augustus. So he's always just doing whoever's in charge, I'm that guy's buddy, right? Because I know where the true power lies. Garrett, you were saying something?
The Roman Republic was reorganized into the Roman Empire.
Right, so at this time, the Republic falls, the Senate loses power. Eventually, once Augustus takes power, it's a one-man emperor. Augustus can do whatever he wants, okay? Because he's rich, he's powerful, he's got buddies. Whatever he says goes. He appoints who's in charge of everything. He's okay with Herod, so he says, okay, Herod, you can go be king. Okay? So, Herod, in the process of all this, becomes in charge of Judea, and we talked a little, there was some groaning last time about some of the weird stuff the Hasmoneans did with their relatives and who married who and who killed who and stuff. It was about to get much worse with Herod. Okay? Herod marries a Herodian princess named Mariam, eventually kills her because he's paranoid. But he didn't just marry her, he also married 9 other women. So just a reminder, we started this whole Maccabean revolt thing here with Mattathias. Eventually down the line we go through Judas Maccabeus, Simon rules, Hyrcanus rules, Aristobulus rules, Janaeus rules, Salome rules. We have the fight between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Eventually Herod the Great marries Hyrcanus' granddaughter Mariamne. So Herod the Great is trying to legitimize his claim on the Judean throne, okay, through marriage. Here's a list of Herod's wives and children. Okay, I'm just going to read this. So his first wife Doris had a son named Antipater II, who was executed by Herod. Mariamne was the daughter of a Maccabean prince. She had 2 kids, also both executed by Herod. Mariamne II, the daughter of another high priest, had Herod II, who ended up not ruling anything. Malthus, who I think was, I forget what her ethnicity is, but it's not Jewish. They have Archelaus and Antipas, who we'll hear more about in a minute. Cleopatra of Jerusalem, that's not the Cleopatra of Egypt, has a son named Philip, who eventually is a tetrarch. And then he has 5 more wives. One of them was his cousin, one of them was his niece. So this guy had 10 wives. So this guy is doing everything in his power. Why not marry someone else if it'll give me political power, right? So I'm going to walk you through here because the story of Herod is just, the short story is Herod did everything he could to make the Romans happy. The Jews hated him because he wasn't Jewish. And Herod eventually became paranoid, okay? What is the big thing that Herod does in the Gospel of Matthew?
The murder of the innocent.
The murder of the innocents.
Yeah.
So he tries to
The
kill
babies.
Jesus when the wise men come.
Yeah.
And then he kills a whole bunch of babies, right? You'll see that's not the only person he killed because he was paranoid, right? He killed a lot of his own family. So I'm just going to read through this whole thing. I've got like 3 slides of this. And it's just wild. It's scary. You think America's nuts. Okay? Your risk of dying a violent death is as low as it's been in the history of the humanity. Okay? I know it seems like we have a lot of scary things happening, but your risk of dying a violent death is way lower than it's ever been in the history of mankind. Okay? Between wars, violence, crime, all that stuff. It's way better now. So let's just brief little interlude into the life of Herod. So, in 39 BC, he starts a war with the Hasmoneans to get control back from the Parthians. After the conquest of Jerusalem, Mark Antony executes Antigonus III. In 36, Herod makes his 17-year-old brother-in-law, Aristobulus III, high priest, fearing the Jews would appoint him as king of the Jews in his place. So Herod decides, well, I need to go fill the high priest with someone who's Jewish to sort of appease the masses, so they'll calm down a little bit. Aristobulus III, 1 year later, mysteriously drowns at a party when all of Herod's guards were around him. Okay, so that didn't last very long. There's a war with the Nabatean kingdom in 32. In 31, there's a big earthquake in Judea. Octavian defeats Mark Antony, and Herod switches allegiances to him. Remember, Octavian is Caesar Augustus, same guy. Later on, Herod confirms Augustus confirms Herod as the king of Judea. In 29, Herod starts to get scared. I'm not going to read this thing, but basically, one of Herod's, I know I'm going to read it, actually. According to Josephus, amid Herod's great passion and jealousy concerning his wife Mariamne, she learns of Herod's plans to murder her and stops sleeping with him. Herod charges her with adultery and puts her on trial. His sister Salome is the primary witness against her. So Herod's sister doesn't like Herod's wife. and accuses her of adultery. Miriam's mother, Alexandra, makes an appearance to further incriminate the daughter. Historians speculate Alexandra was next on Herod's list to be executed, and she only did this to save her own life. So the mom testified against her own daughter to save her own life. Miriam is executed. Alexandra declares herself queen, stating that Herod was mentally unfit to serve, and Herod executes her as well. So, Maccabean dynasty is getting smaller and smaller.
Task victims.
Yes. Herod executes his brother-in-law, Kosabar, husband of Salome and father to Bernice, for conspiracy. There's a large festival. They have a big festival in Jerusalem. We start to see the one of the other ways that Herod tried to calm everybody and make them not as mad that a non-Jew is ruling over them is he starts to build stuff. And he starts building a lot of stuff. So he builds a theater and an amphitheater in Jerusalem to make everybody happy. So they have a big festival about this. In 27, an assassination attempt is foiled. Herod rebuilds Samaria, renames it Sebast. Okay, because Sebast is another name for Octavian in a different language. I think it's in Greek. Herod starts importing grain from Egypt. So not only does Herod start building things, he actually starts feeding the people. So Herod was very paranoid, but also kind of a really good administrator, right? He gets jobs done. He just happens to be kind of psychotic, right? He begins construction of a big port, which eventually becomes the seat of Roman power. This is right on the Mediterranean coast. In 23, Herod builds a palace in Jerusalem as well as a fortress. His third wife, Mariamne, he marries his third wife, the daughter of the high priest. So he makes a political marriage, decides this other guy gets to be high priest because he marries his daughter. Augustus grants Herod the regions. So in 22, Augustus's region is made bigger. In 20, this is the biggest thing about Herod. He begins to expand the Temple Mount, right? So who built the last temple? The one that he's expanding on. Ezra and Nehemiah, those guys. Herod decides, I'm going to build an even bigger one because this is really going to make the Jews like me. Guess what? It didn't. They still loved it, but it didn't work. Okay. Herod travels to Rome for the second time. Herod starts supporting Jews elsewhere in the kingdom. He's really trying to make this work. He makes one of his sons his heir. His heir switches all the time. Herod suspects his sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. He puts them on trial. He amends it and then later kills them. War breaks out again. Now, a brief thing, and I haven't forgotten about this, Pam. I will get a website and I will put this on there for you. But just to show you the kind of construction that Herod does. So this is what the Temple Mount might have looked like when Ezra rebuilt the temple. Okay? Herod takes it from that to that.
That's big.
Okay?
Wow.
Way bigger. He makes the courtyard bigger. But not only that, he puts in this big thing over here. This big, I forget the name. I don't know if that's Solomon's portico or not. But he puts in all these buildings over here. You know what people do there? Business. Right? This is more of the pagan influence encroaching on the temple. So people have this place with their storage. They can do business there. This is the place to be if you want to get business done in Jerusalem. So, where do I want to go? Herod again accuses his kids. Augustus gives them permission to prosecute his kids. Eventually he kills them. In 6, there's a revolt by the Pharisees. Herod kills a bunch of those. Antipater is charged with plotting to murder. He's killed. Herod names his son Antipas from his 4th marriage as successor. Then there's a big issue in 4 BC. This is right before his death. Young disciples of the Pharisees smash the golden eagle over the main entrance to the temple after the teachers label it an idolatrous symbol. Herod arrests them, brings them to court, sentences them. Augustus approves the death penalty. Herod executes his son, changes his will again. Now another one of his kids rules as ethnarch over Judea, while Antipas and yada yada yada. But the big thing here is this is right around the time that this happens. Okay, So now when they had departed, this is the wise men depart. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children of Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So, right before Herod dies, he gets super paranoid. He ends up killing a bunch of his own children. And then he hears from these rich guys out in Parthian country, oh, hey, we heard there's a king being born. So what does Herod do? He freaks out and he kills everyone, right? So, Herod, really effective king in an administrative sense, does all this bad stuff. Now,
Basically the Ivan the Terrible of Judea.
yeah, so he's, mob killings all over the place, kills a bunch of kids. We've all heard about this 1,000 times, but this is the guy, right? So at this time when Herod dies, eventually the Romans have taken control of all this area here. This Caucasus area, the Caucasus Mountains, which are right here, this area gets fought over a lot, but basically this border here becomes sort of the permanent border of Rome for about 100, 120 years, okay? So the world borders are kind of set at this point. Eventually, we've got another 12 minutes to wrap this up. This is a picture of Herod's, the Herodian dynasty here. So you've got Herod the Great. They only have space here to list 5 of his 10 wives, which is kind of fun. Eventually, he has 2 kids, Archelaus and Antipas, who we'll talk about in a minute. Herodias here. Who's Herodias? Why is that familiar?
Paul,
Huh?
Paul, his beginning.
John.
Not Paul. John the Baptist.
That's what.
Right, yeah. Right? So Herodias is eventually marries Herod. Herodias was married to Herod II, divorces him, and marries Herod Antipas. And that's John the Baptist basically walks up to Herod Antipas and says, hey, you're cheating on your wife. Or that she's cheating on her husband. This is wrong, you can't do this. You're not fit to be a ruler. And he gets killed for it. Right? So we're starting to see some biblical characters come through here.
He wrote, he just asked for
Um,
he executed.
say what?
Yeah, Herodias asked for John to be
Yeah. So Salome, we'll talk about that.
That was
I don't think that gets covered in John. I'm not sure how in detail, but yeah. So John the Baptist, Herod Antipas kind of thinks John the Baptist is like this kind of funny, peculiar, sort of wise guy. He can sense there's something special about him, but at the same time, he knows his wife hates him, but he doesn't really care too much what his wife thinks. So then he's at this big dinner where all his rich buddies are there, and his wife's daughter comes and does this dance in front of everyone. I'll let you fill in the details of what that dance might have looked like and what that did to the men. But after this, in front of all his friends, he says, I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom. And that didn't really mean half his kingdom, but it meant like, I am so rich and powerful and I'm so happy with you, I'll give you anything you want. So then Salome doesn't ask for riches or money, she asks for John the Baptist's head, and then John dies. Right? So this is the end of the last prophet. But there's a couple other characters that are mentioned other than Herod the Great that we might not remember very much. So Herod's kingdom gets split up. His son Herod Archelaus gets sort of central Judea here with Idumea and Samaria. He rules from Herod's death till about 6 or 9 AD. He does such a terrible job, the Romans are like, all right, we'll just take over. Okay? And they assign procurators, and that's, in the line of those governors, that's where Pontius Pilate comes from. This region here, the blue region, Galilee and Perea, that's Herod Antipas, so the guy that eventually kills John the Baptist is in charge of Galilee, where John the Baptist did a lot of his preaching and where Jesus did a lot of his preaching. And then another one of his sons, who basically, the less that's written about you in the Bible, if you're just sort of a side character, the better. nothing really happens. Kind of a boring character, but that's probably a good thing. So he rules over this pagan area up north, not much happens. And then there's this region, the Decapolis here. When Pompey takes over, this whole region here, which is mostly Gentiles, gets split off from Israel forever. So this is full of people who worship Greek gods and Roman gods. And when you hear about the Decapolis, that's what that is. So, Matthew 2:22, so this is right after we hear about Joseph going to Egypt. But when he, Joseph, heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. So what this means is, where was Jesus born? Bethlehem. Very good, okay. So they're at Bethlehem, they go down to Egypt, and the plan was actually to go back to Bethlehem, not to go to Nazareth. The plan was to go back to Bethlehem, and then he hears this Archelaus guy is ruling in Judea, so you better not go there. So he actually goes back up to Nazareth because of this guy Archelaus. So that's why Jesus ends up growing up in Galilee. Okay? Thing I never remembered the Archelaus verse. In 320, Herod Antipas talks about the fact that he locked up John in prison, or Luke talks about how Herod Antipas locked John up in prison. In Luke 13 is the reference I missed. At that very same hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, that's Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course." Okay? So, Herod Antipas wants to kill Jesus because Jesus is causing trouble. And what's interesting about this is, who comes to tell Jesus that Herod wants to kill him? Pharisees. Right? Okay, we know there were some Pharisees that liked Jesus. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, there's other ones too. In Luke 23, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, that's Herod Antipas, one of the kids, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. So remember, when Jesus is tried, Pilate tries to say, "Oh, well, this guy belongs to that guy, so you go deal with him. I don't want to deal with him. So go over, and Herod Antipas should deal with him." And Herod Antipas is like, "Ah, good try. Go back." Okay? And then lastly, in Acts 12, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. So this is actually the next Herod in line after all this, a guy named Herod Agrippa. There's another Herod, but in the Bible, he's just called Herod. So it's important to know it's not all the same guy. He kills James, the brother of John, and he throws Peter in prison. Okay? So there's a lot of Herods. This was a helpful diagram I found late last night. So Herod the Great tries to kill Jesus. He's got kids. John the Baptist rebukes Herod Antipas' marriage to Herodias. And then King Herod Agrippa kills James the Apostle and Peter. Okay? And then later on, there's this other guy that puts Paul in prison. So, lastly, what happens after all this? Okay, so, in the time from basically when Herod takes power, all the way through to the picture seen here, there are a lot of revolts. All the time. And a lot of the times, you know what the Romans do to the people who revolt? How do they do it?
Destroy them.
They crucify them. Okay? So, I didn't pull it up, but I have another book that lists, like, just in, Pontius Pilate was in charge of Judea for 10 years. There were, like, 7 huge revolts during his time. Okay? And we only hear about the one from Barabbas, and maybe another one where he tried to bring these pagan symbols in. So there's lots and lots of revolts. Eventually, the Jews get so fed up that it happens again and again. I mean, it sounds, I don't want to say inarticulate, but it just happens again and again, where they revolt, they get smashed down, the Romans take away power, and then slowly they build up more people, and then they revolt again. Eventually, in 66, there's a huge uprising. And some people think this is, well, the 70 years that are mentioned in the book of Daniel. 66 is about 70 years after Herod died. Maybe the revolts that happened when Herod died were 70 years after the Romans took power. So there's a lot of 70s in there. There's a lot of festivals, because remember, at festivals, all of the men in the entire nation all come together and hear a whole bunch of preaching and partying. So they all decide, all right, this is the time we're going to do it. We don't want to be ruled over by other people. So in 66, there's a lot of uncertainty in Rome. They all revolt. For a few years, they actually stave the Romans off. And then eventually, this guy named Vespasian comes in, and this is what happens to Jerusalem. So he comes in, the temple's destroyed. Vespasian goes off, takes Josephus with him. Remember, Josephus tries to play his cards right and says, hey, you're going to be the emperor someday. And then Vespasian's like, you know what, I am. So he takes Josephus with him, and that's how we know most of our intertestamental history is from Josephus, actually. As I said when I talked about him in earnest, the most common phrase in a biblical commentary is according to Josephus. Okay, and there's this big revolt. The Jews destroy the city. They don't just take over, they tear everything down, the walls, the town, the people. 70 years later, there's another revolt called the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Jews, not only, they destroy everything again, somebody's acclaimed as the Messiah, and the Romans are like, all right, you don't get to exist as a people anymore. You're all going to leave. You're either going to get sold into slavery or you're going to run away and hide. A bunch of Jews move to Babylon. That becomes the center of Judaism. And then this is the Jewish diaspora. And there's not a Jewish state until 1948. Right? And that's a totally different thing. It's not connected at all to God's people. The Israeli state has nothing to do with the Bible. Okay? But eventually this happens. Okay? Now, why is this important for Christians? Why is the destruction of the temple important for Christians? Who is our temple? Jesus, right? Okay? The temple was important because that's the place where God's people went to get forgiveness, right? We're going to do these sacrifices and then God will forgive us, right? We don't have to do that anymore, okay? After this happens, right before this happens, you know what all the Christians in Jerusalem did? They ran away. You know what they did with them? You know what they did when they ran away? They told people about Jesus.
No, it spread Christianity.
Right? So this was one of the best things that happened to Christianity because it made all the Christians get out of Dodge. Okay? So they went to the world. They told people about Jesus. Eventually, those people told people about Jesus. Eventually, those people told people about Jesus. And then eventually, all of us got in this room here today. Right? Okay? So, thank you so much. I have had such a blast diving into history. Some of this stuff a lot of this stuff will be relevant when we study the Gospel of John. But in 2 weeks, we'll be back here. We'll start the Gospel of John. I've got 2 big old blue commentaries for that. It's going to be great. I can't wait to read and stay up late on Saturday nights to get ready to teach the class. It's going to be great, Caitlin, isn't it? Sure? Yeah? But next week, I'm taking off so that I don't have to do that. Happy birthday to my daughter Birdie. She turns 8 tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday.
She got her ears pierced yesterday. She looks beautiful. Yeah, so it's been a wonderful summer, and then I'm excited to get back in 2 weeks. So let me finish in prayer with Psalm 126. Oops, that's not right now. When Jesus restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. Jesus has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Jesus, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Amen.
Amen.
Woo. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.